Hello students. So in this chapter we will be looking at the chemistry of life. A lot of you might be wondering, why do we need to know chemistry in the health sciences field? But keep in mind, everything that you utilize or apply in the medical field is based on chemistry, because chemistry is equal to medicine. So in this chapter, we'll cover different parts of an atom, what are an element, what are atoms, ions and isotopes, what are the different types of bonds formed in different types of atoms and ions, what are organic and inorganic molecules, the basic biochemicals and biomolecules found in the body, important organic molecules found in the body, what is pH and the differences between acids and bases and how they relate to the human body, the major functional groups, and the basic biomolecule, which is carbs, fats, and proteins, and nucleic acid, which is the genetic material. And we'll briefly look at enzymatic reaction and understand the basics of enzymatic reactions. Now, in life, everything is made up of, we are made up of a whole bunch of different elements. Everything around us is made up of a whole bunch of different elements. So every chemical reaction in the body is basically based on the chemical characteristics of the elements that we are made of. So basically, matter is anything that makes up space and has mass. So we know of three states of matter: solid, liquid, and gas. Is what you've been taught in school. However, a few years ago, a scientist discovered something called as Bose-Einstein condensates, and then you have the plasma of plasma TV. Now, all matter is made up of element. It doesn't matter whether it's living or non-living. We are all made up of different types of elements. So the organisms which are living matter are made up of elements like oxygen, nitrogen, carbon, hydrogen, sulfur, phosphorus, potassium, calcium, and iron, to name a few. And what is an element? Element is any substance that cannot be broken down into anything simpler by ordinary chemical means. So there are 92 naturally occurring elements which serve as building block of all living and non-living matter. So the organisms which are alive are made up of carbon, hydrogen, nitrogen, oxygen, phosphorus, and sulfur majorly. And then you have other elements like calcium, potassium, magnesium, zinc, and iron, etc. That make up the elemental makeup of a living. On this side you see plants, and here you see a woman with a growth on her neck. Some of you might probably know what this is. This is called goiter. And why do we see plants? Because plants look green and lush because they have been provided with nutrient. The moment you see stunted growth or yellowing of leaves, you know they are nutrient deprived, and that's why they started showing stunted growth, poor yield, and yellowing of leaves. Now this lady over here has a condition known as goiter that we'll study in endocrine system, but this condition is basically an enlargement of the thyroid gland due to iodine deficiency, and that is the reason you see iodized salt in the grocery store when you go pick salt. If you actually look at the bottle, it says iodized salt. And long back, the a lot of people were showing goiter due to deficiency of iodine in food, and in order to counteract the ill effects of iodine deficiency, iodine was added to salt. So people can add salt to the food and make up for the deficiency of iodine as well. So that's just one example of why elements are important on a day-to-day basis. So what is an atom? An element is something that cannot be broken down by chemical means into a smaller substance. An atom itself is the smallest part of an element that displays the chemical properties of that element. So the atoms are made up of something called as subatomic particles. There are three types of subatomic particles: protons, which are positively charged, neutrons that are neutral, and electrons that are negatively charged. Protons and neutrons are present in the nucleus of the atom. So in a particular element, say hydrogen, no matter which type of hydrogen you're looking at, they'll always have the same number of protons. So the number of protons in an element will never change. When you change the number of protons, you basically give rise to a new element. Now the neutrons, they are uncharged, and when you change the number of neutrons, you change the property of the element slightly to form something called as an isotope that we'll look at later, and electrons are negatively charged. So you may want to take a minute to look at what a periodic table is. Periodic table basically gives you a whole chart of all the different elements. This is an example from the periodic table. Hydrogen is the first element in the periodic table. And right over here is the atomic number, because it's the first element of the periodic table. And that's the symbol H. And right over here you see the atomic mass. The atomic mass is the sum of the protons and neutrons in the nucleus, whereas the atomic number is always equal to the number of protons in the nucleus. Now this picture over here shows the Bohr atomic structure. It is just the simple way of representing an atom and the electrons around the nucleus in that atom. So this is helium, which is the second element in the periodic table. So the atomic number of helium is 2. Like we talked about, the atomic number is equal to the number of protons in the nucleus. So this element helium has 2 protons, and the atomic mass of helium will be the number of protons plus the number of neutrons. So the atomic mass of helium will be equal to 2 plus 2. That will be equal to 4. Okay. Again over here, another example is of carbon. Carbon, the atomic number is equal to 6. And the atomic number is always the number of protons in the nucleus. So the number of protons in the nucleus is 6. The mass over here is 12. And the number of protons we know is 6. So how many neutrons will the carbon have? It will have 6 neutrons, right? 12 minus 6, which will tell you the number of neutrons in the element. Alright, so if you draw the Bohr atomic structure, the nucleus will contain the protons and neutrons. This element is carbon, so it has 6 protons and 6 neutrons in the nucleus. And surrounding the nucleus, you see orbits. So the electrons basically revolve in hypothetical orbits around the nucleus. And the electrons are denoted as E minus because they are negatively charged. So this slide shows the Bohr atomic model of different elements. Now, every element tries to obtain stability. So in nature, they try to combine with other elements to obtain something called as the octet rule. It's called the octet rule. As per the octet rule, the outermost shell of an element should obtain the maximum number of electrons that it can possibly hold. Now, for example, we looked at helium. Helium, the atomic number is 2, so it has 2 protons inside, and it has 2 electrons in the first energy level, which we call the orbit. So in this case, helium is already stable because it has obtained 2 electrons in the outermost shell. Because 2 is the maximum number of electrons the first energy level can hold. Now in case of carbon, it has 6 protons, 6 electrons, and 6 neutrons. So these 6 electrons revolve around the nucleus in orbit. So the first energy level can hold 2 electrons. So that's full. Now the second energy level that you see over here can hold up to 8 electrons. But carbon only has 4 more to spare, so you only see 4 electrons in the outermost shell. So as per the octet rule, carbon needs 8 electrons in the outermost shell to become stable. So carbon attaches to other elements like hydrogen in order to make the outermost shell full by filling it with 4 additional electrons. And by adding 4 more electrons to the outermost shell, it can fulfill the octet rule. Similarly over here, nitrogen has 2 electrons in the first energy level, but it has more electrons to fill. So the other electrons go sit in the second energy level. So the second energy level has 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 electrons. So the second energy level needs 3 more electrons to fulfill the octet rule and to make nitrogen more stable in nature. So nitrogen needs 3 more electrons to fulfill the octet rule. So nitrogen will combine with other elements like hydrogen. So nitrogen will combine with 3 hydrogen atoms to fulfill the octet rule. Similarly, sodium has 2 in the first energy level, and sodium has 8 in the second energy level. But the outermost energy level, which is the third energy level, only has 1 electron. So in order to fulfill the octet rule, sodium should either lose this electron or it should gain 7 more electrons to fulfill the octet rule. And for this reason, sodium is really reactive. Now right over here you see Bohr atomic model of different elements, and these are all stable elements. Helium has fulfilled 2 electron need in the outermost shell, so helium is pretty stable. Neon has 2 in the innermost shell, and then it has 8 in the outermost shell, so the outermost shell is stable. The octet rule has been fulfilled. And argon has 2 in the first energy level, 8 in the second energy level, and 8 in the third energy level. So the octet rule has been fulfilled again. Krypton, on the other hand, has a lot of electrons. However, the outermost energy level already has 8 electrons. So krypton has fulfilled the octet rule, and for this reason helium, neon, argon, and krypton are all really stable in nature, whereas elements like sodium, carbon, nitrogen, they have not fulfilled the octet rule, so they combine with other elements to fulfill the octet rule. So the valence electron is the number of electrons in the outermost shell. It can have, an element can have 8 electrons in the outermost shell or just 1 or 2 electrons. And the number of electrons in the outermost shell determines what types of chemical bond the element will form or the atom will form. And we just looked at octet rule. An atom is most stable when the outer shell of the electron is full. So the first electron orbital can hold 2 electrons. The second orbital can hold a maximum of 8 electrons, while the third can actually hold 16. However, it can be stable when it obtains a minimum of 8 electrons in the third orbital. So the urge of elements to obtain 8 electrons in the outermost shell make them combine with other elements to form compounds and molecules. Like oxygen is a molecule, and any chemical that is made up of more than one type of element is usually called a compound. Now, minerals are inorganic elements that are extracted from soil by plants and passed on through food chains to humans and other living beings, like calcium, potassium, chlorine, magnesium, potassium, oil, calcium, phosphorus, and sodium. All of these are minerals that we obtained through plants and animals, and they make up to 4% of the body weight. And these minerals are really important. For example, calcium helps in formation of bones and teeth. And if we don't have enough calcium, we end up having brittle bones and weak teeth. And a lot of these minerals are also very important in functioning of enzymes and also in contraction of muscles that we'll see later in the semester. Now, electrolytes are mineral salts needed for nerve and muscle function. Now, when a person is dehydrated and when they draw blood from the person, they do an electrolyte panel, so they see the concentration of minerals present in the blood, and by knowing so, they can actually check whether the person has more potassium or very less potassium, too much calcium, too little calcium. And all of this is important because somehow all of these minerals help in proper functioning of the heart, muscles, and body muscles. So the imbalance in the electrolytes in blood can also lead to several fatal conditions, and we look at it when we study the cardiac system in the AP2 semester. So right over here you see chemical elements, and majority of the elements that make up human body are oxygen, carbon, hydrogen, nitrogen, calcium, and phosphorus. And other elements make up the remaining percentage. So major elements make up 98.5% of the elements in the body. So atoms, like we said, are electrically neutral in the atom stage because electrons and protons balance each other out. So what happens when an electron is not equal to proton? Right? And that's what we'll look at in just a moment. So this picture shows you the sodium atom. Remember, we talked about sodium having only one electron in the outermost shell. So this makes sodium really reactive. Now over here you see the chemical structure of chloride or chlorine atom. Chlorine has 17 protons, 18 neutrons, and 17 electrons. So the first shell, chlorine has 2 electrons. The second shell, chlorine has 8 more electrons. The third shell, chlorine only has 7 electrons. So neither sodium nor chlorine have fulfilled the octet rule. So they constantly look for electrons to fulfill the octet rule. So in nature, it's very common for sodium to combine with chlorine, and sodium only has one electron in the outermost shell. So sodium says, hey, I'll just lose this electron. It's just so much easier than looking for 7 more electrons. And chlorine says, cool, I'll just take this electron and fulfill my octet rule. So this type of bonding is called an ionic bond. So because sodium loses an electron, the sodium ion gains a slightly positive charge because you have lesser electrons compared to the protons on the inside. Now the chlorine, on the other hand, gains an electron. So the number of electrons is larger than the number of protons currently. So the chlorine gains this negative charge. So this becomes Cl-. So these are called ions. So when sodium loses an electron and chloride gains an electron, we obtain ions. Sodium becomes a cation because the net charge is positive. Chloride becomes an anion because it gains a negative charge. So this type of bond between two elements is called an ionic bond. And each of these over here, this is a sodium ion, and this over here is a chloride ion. So in nature, when ions are formed, they can also form something called as free radicals, which are short-lived particles with unusual number of electrons. So they have reacted, but they are not stable yet for various reasons due to the nature of the chemical particle. So these trigger a lot of destructive reactions in the cell that can lead to cell death, death of heart tissue, aging, and so on. So for this purpose, we have a lot of enzymes that sole purpose is to neutralize free radicals in the cells to reduce the toxicity and destruction of the cells. Now, our cells also have antioxidants, and antioxidants can be in the form of vitamins that we consume, or it can be in the form of enzymes that help in neutralizing free radical. One of the most common antioxidants is superoxide dismutase and enzymes like catalase that neutralize free radicals to destroy the toxicity of free radicals. So they basically act upon the free radicals and neutralize them or convert them into a less toxic form. So we briefly talked about electrolytes, which are substances that form ions in water, like when you dissolve salt in water. Salt is basically sodium chloride. So in water, salt become ions. So they ionize in water. So salt breaks into Na plus and Cl minus. Now electrolytes can carry a charge and can pass through the cell, in and out of the cell. So they basically can cross the membrane or the wall around the cell. And this triggers events known as action potential, which is really important in muscle contraction. So why is muscle contraction important? It's because your muscles, your skeletal muscles need to contract to help you in movement, and your heart muscles need to contract and relax to pump blood throughout the body. So low potassium can, for example, be caused by excessive alcohol, and it can severely affect the heart and cause a cardiac arrest. So if you have very little potassium in your body, it can lead to cardiac arrest. And if you have too much loss of sodium ions in the body, it can lead to muscle cramps and sometimes in coma. Calcium is very important in maintaining bone density. And chloride ions, for example, hang out with sodium ions, and they help in maintaining the osmolarity in the blood. So magnesium, on the other hand, is used to make enzyme function more efficiently. So a very natural electrolyte is coconut water. So coconut water naturally have all these electrolytes. So in a lot of different places, they actually drink coconut water when it's the middle of summer, really hot. They drink more coconut water than electrolytes like Gatorade. So when we go further into the subject, you will understand that electrolytes are really important in physiology. So isotopes. Isotopes are atoms of the same element with different number of neutrons. If you remember, we talked about neutrons. The protons in a cell, in an element, never change. But when you change the number of neutrons, it can lead to something called as isotopes. Now, isotopes can be radioactive. So as they decay, so these are not stable, so they are prone to decay. And as they decay, they emit radioactive, they emit radiations. So they degrade till they become more stable. Okay, so this picture over here shows 3 different forms of carbon. The first one, the atomic number is 6, but the mass number is 12. So you know that the number of protons is 6. In all cases, the atomic number is 6 because the number of protons in the same element never changes. Now remember, the atomic mass is the sum of protons and neutrons. So over here you have 6 protons and 6 neutrons. Over here you have 6 protons and 7 neutrons. And over here you have 6 protons and 8 neutrons. So the number of neutrons can change, and it leads to the formation of isotopes. Now, keep in mind, all the 3 elements are still carbon, but they are really unstable. It's like a person carrying too many boxes. If they have too much of something, they continue to decay until they attain stability. So they release energy in form of radiations as they decay. So these elements, which are isotopes, can be used in the medical field for detecting things like cancer. Now this picture over here shows the use of radioactive substances for detecting tumorous cells. So the first picture is of a tumorous tissue in the thyroid gland, and the second one is of a glioblastoma, or tumor in the brain tissue. So usually for the PET scan, if you have actually known somebody with cancer, they are given radioactive glucose a couple hours before the test, and they drink the glucose, and then after 2 hours they are asked to do a PET scan, and the PET scan basically shows the regions where you have the tumorous tissue. Reason being, the glucose is radioactive, and these tumorous tissues are really active as well. So they absorb too much glucose from the blood cell because they constantly multiply. And these tumorous tissue basically glow in the PET scan, and that's how they detect a tumorous tissue using radioactive substances. So high level of radiation can also be applied in the labs to kill bacteria. So currently research is being done to treat fruits with high amounts of radiation to prolong the shelf life of fruits. Now physicians use radiation therapy. Now this one over here is a gamma knife wherein gamma radiation is being used to excise a tumor from the brain. Now one of these instruments is actually present in Vanderbilt Medical Center. It's a really sophisticated and expensive instrument which can be used to excise tumor really precisely. This picture over here shows isotopes of hydrogen. Keep in mind the number of protons never change because we still call it hydrogen. So here you see one proton, one electron, and you see one proton and one neutron and one electron. So in an isotope, the number of neutrons change, but the number of protons never change. So tritium, you see one proton and you see two neutrons. So atoms basically continue to react till they obtain stability. So they're going to react with other elements to form elements or compounds to fulfill the octet rule. So this results in different types of bonds. The first one we looked at is an ionic bond, and as a result you have formation of ions like Na plus and Cl minus. So an ion is an atom that gains or loses electron to become more stable. So sodium ion lost an electron to chloride, and chloride ion gained an electron from sodium to become electrically charged. Okay. So covalent bond is formed when atoms share electrons. Hydrogen only has one electron in the outermost shell. So hydrogen combined with another hydrogen atom to form a hydrogen molecule. So this sharing of atoms is known as covalent bond. So now both of these hydrogen atoms have two electrons that they share with each other. Similarly, oxygen forms double covalent bond. So it combines, well, it needs two electrons to fulfill, well, needs the octet rule. So oxygen basically shares, oxygen molecule shares two pairs. So it forms a double covalent bond. Nitrogen shares three pairs of electrons to form a nitrogen molecule. So it forms a triple covalent bond. And oxygen needs, the carbon needs 4 atoms to fulfill the octet rule. So with oxygen, carbon forms a double covalent bond to form CO2 molecule. So this can be denoted by drawing the structural formula. Now here you know hydrogen has shared only one pair of electrons. This one has one on the outermost shell, this one has one, so they end up sharing a pair. Here oxygen shares 2 pairs, so 2 from the outermost shell, and over here H2O, which is nothing but water, shares 2 pairs with 2 hydrogen atoms. So these are some common formulas that we'll come across in anatomy and physiology. So polar molecule forms when there's unequal sharing of electrons in covalent bond. And water is one of the most important polar molecules. Now keep in mind these are not the same as ions. Ions dissociate in water to actually form ions. Like sodium ions and chloride ions are basically table salt, when you dissolve it in water, break up into sodium and chloride. But polar molecules, on the other hand, are covalent bonds, which ends up being unequally shared. So a water molecule is formed when two hydrogen atoms form single polar covalent bond with one oxygen atom. So oxygen has 8 electrons in the outermost, 8 electrons revolving around the nucleus, and hydrogen only has 1 electron around the nucleus of the atom. So the first energy shell of oxygen ends up having 2 electrons, and this is the second energy shell. So you have 6 electrons in the second energy shell. Hydrogen shares its lone electron with oxygen to form water molecule. However, the oxygen is a really strong atom, so it ends up pulling the electron more towards itself. So the electrons move closer to the oxygen molecule. And because of this, the electrons end up going more towards oxygen, giving the oxygen molecule a slightly negative charge. We call it a delta negative. And the hydrogen atoms end up having a slight positive charge because the electrons are present farther away from the hydrogen atom. So this results in water being a polar molecule. So this imbalance in the electrical charge of water molecule leads to the formation of something called as a hydrogen bond. So the polar molecule ends up acting like an atom which is in need of electron. So if you remember from the previous slide, the hydrogen ends up having a slight positive charge, oxygen ends up having a slight negative charge. And this is the same for every molecule in water. So each water molecule ends up having a charge. So water acts like a polar molecule which needs to form another bond to fulfill the octet rule. Not really, but it acts like that due to the presence of a charge. So the most common example of a hydrogen bond is in water itself. So this figure shows the covalent bond between hydrogen and oxygen to form a water molecule. And due to the unequal sharing, it ends up having a positive and a negative charge. And this results in something called as a hydrogen bond that is illustrated as tiny dots over here. So the negative end of one water molecule forms slight weak interactions known as hydrogen bond with the positive charge of another molecule. So these hydrogen bonds are not only present in water, they're just basically weak bonds in polar molecules. Now these bonds are weak compared to covalent and ionic bonds, but these weak interactions play a very important role in environment and living things. They're important in the structure of DNA, which is a genetic material. They're also important in some interesting properties that you see in water. And as a result, water is a universal solvent. And substances that are hydrophobic are not soluble in water because they're hydrophobic, afraid of water. And substances that are hydrophilic are able to dissolve in water, like sugar and salt are hydrophilic. So polar molecules can usually dissolve in water, and non-polar substances cannot dissolve in water because they don't have a charge. And keep in mind, water is a polar molecule. Now, let's look at some other inorganic molecules that are important to humans, like carbon dioxide. Carbon dioxide is basically CO2. CO2 is a byproduct of cellular respiration, and cellular respiration is the means by which we make something called as ATP, adenosine triphosphate, which is the energy currency of the cell. And we need oxygen for cellular respiration because it is the final electron acceptor in the whole chemical process, which you don't really need to know. Now, water is a universal solvent, and it helps in dissolving everything that is polar. And it also exhibits certain properties known as cohesion and adhesion. Cohesion is when water molecules try to stick to each other. So when you actually pour a glass full of water all the way to the rim, you see a little dome. That is because these water molecules all the way on the top try to stick to each other. So this property is called adhesion. Now, even though you poured water slightly above the surface or above the rim of the glass, water molecules have not started pouring out yet because these water molecules try to stick to the edge of the glass, and this property is known as adhesion. So now cohesion is when water attaches to water, and adhesion is when water attaches to other substances. For example, when you see a tip of water, a drop of water hanging down the edge of a leaf, that is because water has tried to hang on to the leaf as long as it can. So that property is known as adhesion. So the polarity of water also leads to chemical reactivity because it's charged, and also thermal stability because the hydrogen bonds, that is the bonding between the water molecules, can easily make and break as much as possible to absorb as much heat as it can. And that's why you see that near the coastal areas, it's not very hot in the day because these water molecules have really high capacity to absorb heat.